part takes place in a hospital, and it takes place over a short period of time because
In Hollywood, where stardom is currency and image is everything, the idea of invincibility is a myth every actor chases, but few ever attain. Yet if there was anyone who seemed to have broken through the fragile glass of celebrity and cemented himself as untouchable, it was Ryan Reynolds. For years, his name carried the weight of charm, bankability, and wit. He was the man who could make the world laugh with a single quip on a late-night show. The actor who could headline $1 billion superhero franchise while making audiences feel like they were just watching their funniest friend crack jokes in a bar. Marvel had taken gambles before, building its empire on unexpected stars, but Reynolds as Deadpool was no gamble at all. It was destiny. The character's razor-edged sarcasm and anarchic energy mirrored Reynolds' own public persona so perfectly that it was impossible to imagine anyone else behind the mask. He wasn't simply playing Deadpool. He was Deadpool. And yet, against every expectation, against the iron law that Marvel protects its crown jewels at all costs, news broke that Reynolds had been fired. Not rumors, not speculative whispers, but cold, undeniable truth. Fired. The word detonated across the industry, like a bomb. In an ecosystem where creative differences are carefully repackaged into polite press releases, where even the ugliest splits are dressed up as mutual agreements, this abrupt, decisive act was unthinkable. Reynolds wasn't just a star. He was Marvel's golden ticket, the man they had bet billions on. For him to be cast out meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. The shockwaves didn't stop at studio boardrooms or trade headlines. They tore through the carefully curated fabric of Hollywood itself. Because Reynolds wasn't alone in this saga. Standing beside him, always beside him, was Blake Lively, a star in her own right, but also half of one of Hollywood's most powerful couples. Together, they were royalty, the witty, impossibly good-looking pair whose Instagram banner made fans swoon, and whose red carpet appearances projected a rare kind of authenticity in an industry known for artifice. If Reynolds fell, Lively fell too, not because of her own choices alone, but because their careers, their reputations, their entire brand as a couple were inextricably entwined. And so when the scandal began to unravel, it wasn't just about an actor losing his grip on a superhero role. It was about the implosion of an empire built on charm, charisma, and illusion of control. The initial whispers tried to explain it away. Some pointed to creative clashes between Reynolds and Marvel executives. Others suggested scheduling conflicts, too many projects pulling him in different directions. But those who knew the machine understood better. Marvel doesn't cut ties over trivialities. Marvel smooths, negotiates, compromises. Marvel bends entire production schedules to keep its stars happy. For them to sever ties with Reynolds meant something toxic had seeped into the foundation, something that threatened not just one film but the empire itself. And soon, a name began surfacing in the shadows of the story, a name that seemed at first wildly out of place. Justin Baldoni, known not for billion-dollar franchises, but for emotional, heartfelt dramas. Baldoni was celebrated in certain circles as a filmmaker with an uncanny ability to tap into vulnerability and humanity. His projects were small compared to Marvel's behemoths, yet he carried a quiet influence, respected by peers for his sincerity and his knack for drawing raw performances from his actors. He should have had nothing to do with Reynolds or Marvel. Yet suddenly, inexplicably, his name was everywhere, tied to the scandal like a thread leading deeper into the labyrinth. It all began with a film. Not a blockbuster, not a superhero spectacle, but a book adaptation. A story steeped in themes of generational trauma, love, resilience, and survival. Baldoni had championed it from the start, believing in its power to reach audiences desperate for authenticity. He wasn't looking for spectacle. He was looking for truth. Blake Lively was cast in the lead role, a pairing that initially seemed serendipitous. Her approachable star power, her elegance, her ability to project both strength and fragility, felt tailor-made for Baldoni's storytelling. Early promotional clips painted a picture of harmony, of an actress and director aligned in vision. Fans buzzed with anticipation. But behind the curtain, tension simmered. Whispers of unease began to circulate. Whispers that pointed not to artistic disagreements, but to something deeper. A clash of egos, a struggle for control. At first, these whispers seemed insignificant, the usual background noise of Hollywood productions. Every film has its battles, its creative push and pull, but soon the noise grew louder, refusing to stay buried. Insiders began pointing to Baldoni's expanding influence on the project. He wasn't content to simply direct. He was shaping the script, guiding the narrative, and even stepping into a leading role himself. While not unheard of, this multifaceted involvement unsettled Lively. To her, it threatened the balance of power. She had been promised a spotlight, but Baldoni's presence threatened to dim it. What began as subtle discomfort evolved into resentment, and then into conflict, though the public knew nothing of it yet. On red carpets, smiles persisted. In interviews, praises were exchanged. But beneath the surface, pressure built like a fault line waiting to rupture. And rupture it did. Blake Lively, unwilling to let the narrative slip out of her hands, made the first public move. She accused Baldoni of orchestrating a smear campaign, leaking stories to the press that painted her as difficult, demanding, temperamental. In an industry where perception is often more powerful than reality, these were not small accusations. They were career-threatening. Hollywood's history is littered with women whose reputations were destroyed by whispers of being hard to work with, their talent overshadowed by labels imposed by men in power. Lively's framing was clear. She was not simply an actress clashing with a director. She was a woman standing up against systemic bias, against a man trying to sabotage her. The public rallied. Headlines amplified her claims. Social media erupted with sympathy, casting her as the victim, Baldoni as the aggressor. The story fit neatly into an archetype audiences understood too well. The talented actress silenced, the overbearing male director pulling strings. For a moment, it seemed unshakable. Lively had a narrative, and with Reynolds at her side, the power of the combined star power was overwhelming. Baldoni was cornered, his reputation teetering. But then came the receipts. Cold, undeniable, time-stamped receipts. Not rumors, not counter-accusations, but digital trails that told a very different story. Baldoni's team, prepared for storm, released text messages, emails, and records that dismantled Lively's claims piece by piece. The leaks revealed not a woman silenced, but a woman orchestrating her own campaign, leveraging her influence, and invoking the formidable shadow of her husband's power to bend the project to her will. In one particularly damning exchange, Lively referred to Reynolds' network of Hollywood allies as her dragons, a loaded metaphor suggesting she saw them as mythical beasts she could summon that would burn down obstacles. The text painted a portrait of a woman not battling oppression, but wielding her clout with precision. She pushed for script rewrites that favored her vision, demanded marketing strategies that centered her image, and sought control not just over film, but over the public narrative surrounding it. Her accusations against Baldoni, once seen as courageous, began to crumble under the weight of this evidence. What the receipts revealed was not a silenced actress, but a power player willing to manipulate perception to her advantage. The public was stunned. Sympathy turned to skepticism. The neat dichotomy of victim and villain collapsed, replaced by a murkier, far more unsettling reality. Lively was not powerless. She was strategic, ambitious, and calculating. And in that revelation lay the seeds of Ryan Reynolds' downfall. For Reynolds had not been a bystander in the saga. He had been invoked, his influence wielded like a weapon. His reputation, once pristine, was now entangled in the mess. Marvel, ever protective of its empire, could not afford the chaos. Their decision to sever ties with Reynolds, once unthinkable, suddenly made brutal sense. It wasn't about one man or one role. It was about the integrity of a universe too big to risk on scandal. Yet even as the receipts reshaped the narrative, questions lingered. Was Reynolds complicit or merely collateral damage? How much did he know of Lively's maneuvering? And how far was he willing to go to protect her? The answers remained elusive, hidden in the spaces between texts, in the silences that followed each public revelation. What was clear, however, was that Hollywood had been reminded of a truth it often forgets. No star, no matter how beloved, is untouchable. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And so the saga continued, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. where heroes became villains, victims became strategists, and the line between truth and perception blurred until it was nearly impossible to tell them apart. Hollywood thrives on stories, on narratives crafted and consumed. But this time, the story was not on the screen. It was happening behind it, and it was far more dramatic than anything the movies could conjure. Frank, if it were not for women giving me direct and unfiltered feedback in my own life, sometimes gently, sometimes bluntly, always insistently, and if I had not at least tried, however clumsily, to listen to them rather than retreat into the armor of pride or defensiveness, then there is no chance that I would be sitting here and having this conversation today. And that truth, for me, crystallizes into something deceptively simple. As men, we must learn to embrace the full range of our humanity, the vulnerability as much as the strength, the humility as much as the confidence, the listening as much as the speaking. But if there is one constant in the worlds of power, celebrity, and Hollywood, it is that simple truths rarely stay simple for long. They become entangled with ego, warped by ambition, and filtered to the high-voltage machinery of an industry where perception is as valuable as talent, and where narratives can be manufactured, sold, and dismantled in the span of a single news cycle. And nowhere was this collision between simplicity and complexity more visible, more volatile, or more consequential than the storm that began as a creative disagreement, but swelled into a scandal that would consume Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and, perhaps most shocking to a public that had all but canonized him, Ryan Reynolds. For years, Reynolds had existed in the rarefied space of being not merely admired but adored, his career fortified not just by acting chops, but by a carefully calibrated persona. The witty everyman, the self-deprecating father who turned the anxieties of parenthood into punchlines, the charming rogue who never seemed to take himself too seriously. He was in many ways the embodiment of modern celebrity brand building, a man who weaponized transparency, humor, and relatability into something resembling invincibility, and Marvel had not just noticed but capitalized, building billion-dollar bets around the irreverent, foul-mouthed, fourth-wall-breaking Deadpool, a franchise that seemed inseparable from Reynolds himself. And so, when Blake's conflict with Baldoni, initially confined to hushed conversations and private frustrations, spilled into the press and became not just a creative dispute, but cultural event devoured by gossip blogs, podcasts, and social media, Reynolds' silence was at first interpreted as tactical brilliance. He appeared to embody the very image of restraint, a husband standing loyally at his wife's side, but not so entangled as to risk dragging his own reputation into the mud. That studied quietude read as diplomacy, perhaps even wisdom, but as the weeks dragged on and the noise grew louder, that silence began to feel less like neutrality and more like evasion, less like calm and more like concealment. He lingered at the edges of the spectacle like a silhouette, present but indistinct, impossible to ignore yet refusing to declare himself. And this liminal presence fueled endless speculation across every platform imaginable. Was he the dutiful partner, quietly supportive but determined to let his wife fight her own battles? Or was his silence itself a kind of strategy, a performance designed to preserve his Teflon-coated image while she absorbed the damage? This ambiguity, paradoxically, offered comfort to many. It allowed the public to believe that Reynolds remained untainted, that he was still above the fray, still too decent, too funny, too beloved to be sucked into Hollywood's ugliest currents. But then came the first leaks, and with them, the comfort dissolved. The leaks were not about Blake at all. They were about Ryan. Or more precisely, they came from Ryan, tiny fragments at first, easily dismissed as innocuous or contextless. But as more emerged, they began to cohere into something undeniable, a pattern of intent, of orchestration, of manipulation. What had once been interpreted as distance and restraint now revealed itself as calculation. The man who had seemed to hover passively at the sidelines was in fact actively involved, shaping coverage, planning sympathetic framings, encouraging journalists to view Blake less as an aggressor and more as a victim, feeding subtle narratives into the bloodstream of entertainment media with the precision of someone who understood how quickly stories can metastasize. And when these fragments were stitched together, when journalists and gossip sleuths began to map out the communications in sequence, the illusion of neutrality shattered completely. The story was no longer Blake Lively clashing with Justin Baldoni. It was a Lively Reynolds power couple maneuvering behind a curtain, leveraging access, charisma, and influence to corner a director who had, up to that point, carried himself with calm and dignity. And the press, ravenous as ever, did what the press always does. It feasted. Articles dissected every timestamp, every phrase, every implication. Podcasts poured over the leaks with forensic fervor. Social media boiled with hot takes, memes, conspiracy threads, and side-by-side comparisons of Reynolds' public persona. The warm, funny, transparent everyman, and the man glimpsed in those messages, a cold, strategic operator who was not above weaponizing relationships to achieve his ends. Could the same actor who built his empire on candor, who turned self-mockery into a career, truly be orchestrating smear campaigns? Baldoni, refusing to gloat, insisted yes, and the proof he unveiled was devastating. These were not vague suggestions or cherry-picked fragments. They were comprehensive records. Emails, phone logs, notes, coordinated strategies, all time-stamped and cross-referenced. A paper trail too damning to ignore. Within hours of their emergence, they had made their way into Marvel's executive offices. And what executives found there sent shockwaves to the heart of the empire. Reynolds was not just another actor to them. He was Deadpool. He was a cornerstone of their cinematic universe, the irreverent counterweight to their squeaky clean heroes, a box office engine, a brand within a brand. The idea that he was actively involved in discrediting a director was not just awkward or embarrassing. It was a crisis of the highest order, one that threatened to destabilize Marvel's carefully polished image as both a business juggernaut and a cultural institution. Meetings were convened immediately, lawyers summoned, crisis management consultants called in at all hours. Executives fractured into camps. Some argued Reynolds was too valuable to lose, that with the right PR strategy and a carefully worded apology the storm could be weathered. Others argued the opposite, that protecting him would be suicide, that the longer Marvel stood by him, the more their brand risked contagion. Meanwhile, Baldoni, who might have seized a moment for public victory laps, instead chose restraint. He positioned himself as a man standing on principle, a director who valued integrity above ego. And the public, already disillusioned by the leaks, began to contrast his quiet steadiness with the frantic spin emanating from the lively Reynolds camp. And then came the moment from which there was no return. Marvel executives, after reviewing the full, unfiltered cache of receipts, reached a conclusion that insiders would later describe as unanimous and devastating. The evidence was so overwhelming, so damning, that continued partnership was untenable. And in a move that stunned the industry, Marvel announced that it was cutting ties with Reynolds. The statement was uncharacteristically blunt, citing newly disclosed information and concluding flatly that a continued involvement was impossible. Overnight, the Golden Boy was gone. The reaction was instant, seismic, and disorienting. Fans who had adored him flooded social media with disbelief. Commentators scrambled to explain how such a meteoric fall could happen in days rather than years, and Hollywood insiders began to whisper nervously that if Reynolds, arguably the most Teflon-coated star of his generation, could be dropped, then no one was untouchable. Blake, meanwhile, disappeared from the public eye. Her once constant social media voice went silent. Her lawyers severed ties and cited irreconcilable differences, a gesture that suggested fracture and panic behind closed doors. Rumors exploded across industry circles that the couple was scrambling to contain fallout, that they were fighting behind the scenes, that their partnership, once seen as unshakable, was buckling under the weight of exposure. But the tide had turned irreversibly. Marvel's decision thundered across the industry like an earthquake, signaling a recalibration of Hollywood's power dynamics. Debate raged in think pieces on talk shows and across timelines. Had Marvel acted too hastily?